Hi there. This morning I've got a bit of a challenge. I am going to see if I can count the number of grains of sand it would take to fill this cup. Do you think I can do it? Well, let's give it a go. Let's fill it up and see if I can count them. So as I fill that very much to the top and bring it over, do you know, it seems to me that there's an awful lot of very small grains in there. I think maybe I've taken on a bit too much with that. Maybe I need a smaller pot. Maybe like this one. That seems a lot smaller. I'll see if I can do this one. So I'm going to fill it up again, and that's fairly full. So if I tip them out now, I think you'll find there's actually still an awful lot of sand in there, isn't there? I think that's going to be too much to count as well. So I wonder if I've got anything else. Maybe like these. So this is a tablespoon. That seems like that's still quite a bit big. Or a teaspoon. Or a half teaspoon. Or what about this? A quarter teaspoon. That maybe is going to be a bit easier. Counting the number of grains of sand in here rather than this big pot. So here we go. I'm going to fill it up a little bit more, and then if I pour it into this dish, and let's see if we can count it. There we are. But I don't know if you can see, there's still actually quite a lot in there, a large number of individual grains of sand. So if I try and count them, well, there's one there, and there's one there, and one there. This is going to be a bit tricky. I might even need a magnifying glass. But even with that, do you know, the grains are so small and there's so many of them. I don't think I'm going to be able to do that. I think that is just too difficult for me. But does that remind you of a story? Maybe a story from the Bible about counting grains of sand? Well, last week we started thinking about the story of Abraham, and we looked at how when God called him, Abraham chose to follow. So we're going on through the story and seeing something else that happened now. And this week we're looking at a promise that God made to Abraham about counting grains of sand. But Abraham's going to need a lot of faith to believe in God's promise and to wait for it to be fulfilled. So just what was that promise? Well, God said to Abraham that his family, his children, his children's children, and all his descendants will become so big, there'd be so many of them, that it would be impossible to count them. It would be just like trying to count the grains of sand at the shore. But why is Abraham going to need so much faith? Well, you see, by this point, Abraham is already a really old man and he has no children. So how is this going to happen? But this promise is so important that God made it twice. The second time he didn't use grains of sand, he used a different object. Do you know what it was? Or could you guess? Well, let's watch the video and see just what God's promise was and why Abraham is going to have so much faith in God to believe his promises.
Near the very start of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, we find this story about Abraham and Sarah, a grandma and a grandpa. God tells them that they would have a baby. Most grandparents don't have babies, but as we're about to find out, when God makes a promise, he delivers. God had spoken to Abraham when he was 75 years old and said, "Leave your country, your family, and your father's home for a land that I will show you. I'll make you a great nation and bless you." God takes Abraham outside and says, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." But Abraham and Sarah did not have children. How was God going to make their family into a great nation without a single child. It was a promise that seemed so outrageous, so beyond belief, that Abraham and his wife Sarah thought God must have been joking. But Abraham was a man of faith, and so he did just what God had told him. He had to have faith in God. Abraham and Sarah waited and waited and waited. Years passed by, and they didn't seem to be any closer to what God had promised them. With faith in God, they waited. They both went through a lot while this promise waited to be fulfilled. Made some bad choices that hurt others. Made good choices that helped others. But through it all, they trusted the promise of God. Sarah was now 90 years old, and Abraham was 100 years old. God spoke to Abraham and said, "I will bless Sarah. She will have a baby son, and you will call him Isaac." Ha ha ha, he laughed. Sarah laughed too. How could an old woman like me have a baby? But sure enough, God did keep his promise to Abraham and Sarah. They had a son at the exact time God had planned all along. This isn't really a story about Abraham and why he was so special. It's a story about God and why he is so special. Faith is trusting God to do what only God can do. We can have faith and trust in God. God keeps his promises.
This week I've come outside at night time. Have any of you ever looked up at the sky at night before you go to bed? How many stars do you think there are all together in the sky? Can you try and count the stars that you can see in the picture? There are millions of stars. Even with the most powerful of telescopes, we can't see them all. We could never count them all. Did you know? Scientists reckon that there are septillion stars in the universe. For those of you that like maths, that is 10 to the 24th power, or it looks like this. But from where we are on Earth, only 5,000 of those stars are visible. And to a single person looking up from the Earth, even fewer can be seen at one time, because half of the stars are hidden by the planet Earth itself. Wow! Isn't that amazing? Now let's imagine Abraham looking up into a cloudless night sky, unspoiled by streetlights. I wonder how many stars did he think there might be? 100? 1,000 perhaps? Don't forget, in those days there weren't any binoculars and no Hubble Space Telescope to see into the vast galaxy. But I wonder if you noticed in our story that God brought Abraham outside of his tent in the daytime while the sun was still shining. And then he said to them, "Count the stars if you're able." Now, who of us is able to count stars during the daytime? It's hard enough at night time. But they, like Abraham's yet to be born children, are completely invisible in the daytime. But Abraham trusted. He trusted that although he couldn't see the stars that he knew were there behind the blue curtain of the sky, although his wife was old and he was nearly 100 years old, Abraham trusted that he could believe God's promise that one day he would have children. And firmly he believed that. He knew that as he could see the stars appear that night, God would keep his promise. Now there's a verse in the Bible in the book of Galatians, and it says this: "And now that you belong to Christ, You are the true children of Abraham. You are his heirs, and God's promise to Abraham belongs to you. So as followers of Jesus, we too can be part of Abraham's family of faith. And that means that we are like one of those many millions of stars that God told Abraham to count in the sky that night, so very, very long ago. Abraham didn't know how God would keep all of his promises, but Abraham did know that God would. And that's the same kind of faith that we can have in our lives. I wonder, what are some of God's promises that you have a hard time believing sometimes? And I wonder how God's promises to Abraham could help us to believe in all God's promises to us. It's hard to trust God sometimes, isn't it? I know I spend lots of my energy sometimes making sure that I'm creating my own happiness, that I'm setting up enough contingency plans and safety nets so that I will never be left disappointed by God's plans. I definitely need God to help me out. I need to learn to fully rely on and trust in him. So if you get a chance, look up at the sky tonight before you go to bed. And remember, the same God who made the sun, the planets, and all these millions of stars promised one man in a small village in the desert thousands of years ago that he wouldn't leave him without any children. The God who made the galaxies also made you and me, and he never tires of calling out to us, of sending us signs, of going great lengths to greet us and to assure us that he is faithful to his promises, both in the daytime and in the night.